The triage tag on the first body read expectant, and Technical Sergeant Roe Callaghan pulled it off with his teeth, because both his hands were buried inside the chest cavity of a Delvhari child who was drowning in her own fluid. Not water. The Delvhari were aquatic deep-current cetaceans, whose circulatory systems ran on a saline plasma thicker than human blood and colder than anything Roe's trauma kit was designed to handle. The child's torso was a mess of translucent blue skin split open along the lateral gill line where a hull fragment had punched through, and the plasma was pouring out in slow, heavy sheets that pooled on the deck and made the footing treacherous. Roe had his right hand clamped on the severed vessel, and his left pressing a hemostatic pack into the wound, and the pack was dissolving too fast because it was formulated from mammalian tissue, and the Delvhari were not mammals. "Cavallo," he said, "I need the Xenocog, blue case, third shelf." No answer. He looked up. Specialist Inez Cavallo was 20 meters down the corridor, on her knees beside a Delvhari adult whose lower body was pinned under a collapsed support beam. She had her own hands full. Behind her, the corridor stretched into darkness where the emergency lighting had failed, and somewhere in that darkness more of them were crying, not screaming. The Delvhari did not scream. They made a low, resonant keening that traveled through the deck plating and vibrated in Roe's sternum, and it had not stopped since his team cut through the hull 19 minutes ago. 19 minutes. That was all. Roe's internal clock was still counting from the moment they had breached the outer hull of the Delvhari carrier Sulvaan Reach and dropped into the forward habitation tier, and in those 19 minutes he had tagged 11 casualties, performed 2 emergency thoracotomies, and lost 1. The one he lost had been dead before he touched her, a female Delvhari with half her skull caved in by decompression damage, her gill membranes already gray. He had checked her vitals, tagged her black, and moved on because that was what pararescue did. You triaged. You moved. You did not stop. The child under his hands shuddered and a fresh pulse of plasma welled up between his fingers. Roe pressed harder. "Stay with me," he said, though the child did not speak his language and probably could not hear him over the keening. "Stay right here." The Sulvaan Reach had been a deep space passenger carrier civilian, unarmed, built for transiting the Delvhari migration corridors between their spawning systems. 1,200 passengers, mostly families. She had sent her distress call 41 hours ago, after a cascading reactor failure triggered a structural collapse in the aft quarter and vented 6 habitation decks to vacuum. The Delvhari had sealed what they could. They had routed emergency power to the forward tiers. They had sent the call on every frequency their dying comm array could reach. The Galactic Transit Authority had logged the signal 41 hours ago, filed under incident noted recovery assets unavailable. The nearest Delvhari fleet was 92 hours out. The nearest coalition patrol had declined to divert, citing a jurisdictional ambiguity that meant, in practice, that the Delvhari were not important enough to reroute for. The signal had bounced across 3 relay stations before it hit the edge of a human patrol corridor. The UERS Greyhaven, a search and rescue frigate running a standard sweep along the Candrel margin, had picked it up 11 hours ago. Captain Liz Tanaka had read the distress log, checked her fuel state, and turned her ship. She had not asked permission. She had not filed a diversion request. She had turned the Greyhaven and gone to full burn, and she had sent one message back to Fleet Command, responding to civilian distress. Sulvaan Reach. Will advise on arrival. Fleet Command had sent back a jurisdictional caution. Tanaka had not replied. That was 11 hours ago. Now Roe was knuckle-deep in a Delvhari child's chest on a dying ship, and the Greyhaven was clamped to the Sulvaan Reach's dorsal hull like a barnacle on a whale, and his team was spread across 3 decks doing the work that no one else in the galaxy had bothered to do. "Roe," the voice in his earpiece was Staff Sergeant Marin Cade, his team lead. She was 2 decks below in the engineering tier where the structural damage was worst. "Sidrepo." Forward Hab Tier 3. 11 tagged, 2 thoracotomies, 1 expectant reclassified to black. I've got a pediatric case, open lateral trauma, saline plasma hemorrhage. I need the xenocog and I need someone who knows Delvhari vascular anatomy because I'm improvising. Copy. Jace is on his way to you with the Xeno kit. He pulled a Delvhari medic out of the rubble on Tier 4. She's ambulatory, minor lacerations. He's bringing her up. Good, what's your count? A pause, the keening vibrated through the deck. 23 tagged down here, 14 immediate, 6 delayed, 3 expectant. Another pause. The aft section is gone, row. The bulkhead's held, but everything past frame 60 is vacuum. We're not getting back there. Rowe absorbed that. Everything past frame 60. That was the aft habitation block, 400 passengers. He did not ask if there were survivors. The answer was in the pause. Copy, he said. Focus forward. We save what's in front of us. Affirm. The child's pulse under his fingers was thread-like and irregular, and the plasma was still coming, slower now but steady. Rowe shifted his grip, found the torn vessel with his fingertips, and applied direct pressure at the point where the tear met intact tissue. The Delvhari vascular system was different from anything he had trained on. The vessels were reinforced with a cartilaginous sheath that made them rigid and resistant to clamping, and the plasma itself had a viscosity that gummed up his hemostatic agents. He was working blind by feel, in a corridor lit by emergency strips that cast everything in pale amber, and the child's skin was cold against his hands. Not cold because of shock, cold because Delvhari body temperature ran at 14 degrees Celsius. Their entire physiology was built for deep ocean currents, high pressure, low temperature, saline dense. The child's skin had a faint bioluminescent quality, faded now to almost nothing, but Rowe could see the ghost of it in the tissue around the wound, a pale blue-green light that pulsed weakly with the child's heartbeat. Footsteps behind him. Rowe did not turn. Jace. Right here. Sergeant Jace Morrow dropped to one knee beside him and opened the xenobiology trauma kit, a heavy blue case that contained the non-standard coagulants, sealants, and surgical tools that Earth's pararescue teams had started carrying 3 years ago, after the Candrel Corridor incident proved that human medical supplies alone were not enough when the casualties were not human. I've got the Delvhari medic. Her name is, he hesitated. I can't pronounce it. She says to call her Sewer. Sewer, get her over here. Jace turned and spoke to someone behind him, and then a Delvhari stepped into the amber light. She was tall, they all were, built long and hydrodynamic, with smooth blue-gray skin and wide-set eyes that reflected the emergency lighting like dark mirrors. Her left arm was wrapped in a field bandage, human issue, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone holding pain at a distance. She looked at the child on the deck. She looked at Rowe's hands inside the child's chest. Her expression did not change. Delvhari faces were not built for the kind of expressions humans read instinctively, but something shifted in the set of her jaw, a tightening, and she dropped to her knees beside him and placed her long, webbed fingers over his. The vessel, she said. Her voice was low and resonant, the translator rendering it with a faint harmonic undertone. You are holding the secondary lateral. Good. Do not release. The primary is intact. I think so. I can't see it. I can feel it. Her fingers moved beneath his, tracing the anatomy with a precision that made his improvisation feel like butchery. The primary is intact. The secondary is torn at the junction. You need the cartilage sealant, not the coagulant. The coagulant will not bond to the sheath. Jace, cartilage sealant. Jace handed it over. Sewer took it, examined it, and made a small sound that might have been approval or might have been something else entirely. She loaded the applicator and guided it into the wound alongside Rowe's fingers, and together they sealed the tear, his pressure holding the vessel stable while she laid the sealant in a precise line along the cartilaginous edge. The plasma flow slowed. Stopped. The child's bioluminescence flickered, steadied and brightened by a fraction. Sewer sat back on her heels. She looked at Ro. "You are the ones who came." It was not a question. Ro pulled his hands out of the child's chest, wiped them on his thigh. The plasma left a faint blue-green stain that would not come out for days, and reached for a wound closure kit. "We're Earth Search and Rescue. Pararescue Team, UERS Greyhaven. We sent the distress 41 hours ago." "I know." The Authority filed it. The Coalition patrol declined. The Delvhari fleet is still 90 hours out. She paused. "We did not know humans had ships in this corridor." "We had one, that was enough." Sewer watched him close the child's wound. Her dark, reflective eyes tracked his hands, the economy of his movements, the practiced speed of the closure, the way he checked the seal by touch before moving on. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. The keening in the corridor had shifted lower, less urgent, the way a held note drops when the worst of the pressure eases. Ro stood. His knees ached and his lower back was a solid bar of tension, and his hands were stained blue-green up to the wrists, and none of that mattered because the corridor ahead was still full of casualties. He could see them in the amber light, Delvhari adults and children, some sitting against the bulkheads, some lying flat, some holding each other in configurations he did not understand but recognized as family. The ones nearest to him were watching him. They had been watching since he cut through the hull. "Sewer, I need your eyes. You know the anatomy, I don't. Walk the triage line with me and correct my tags." She stood. She was a head taller than him, and the movement was fluid despite the arm injury. "I will." They moved down the corridor together, a human pararescueman and a Delvhari ship's medic, working the line. Ro had already tagged the first 11, but with Sewer beside him, the tags shifted. What he had labeled DELAYED, she reclassified as immediate because of a vascular detail. He could not have known the Delvhari had a secondary circulatory loop that masked hemorrhagic shock until it was nearly terminal. The subtle warning signs were invisible to anyone who had not studied Delvhari physiology. A faint darkening around the gill membranes, a change in the plasma's viscosity that Sewer could detect by pressing 2 fingers to the patient's wrist and counting a rhythm Ro could not hear. 3 patients he had passed over as stable were, in fact, bleeding internally at a rate that would kill them within the hour. "This one," Sewer said, kneeling beside a Delvhari female who appeared to be resting comfortably against the corridor wall. She placed her fingers on the female's throat, held them there, and looked up at Ro. "Immediate. The secondary loop is compensating, but it will fail. You have perhaps 40 minutes. Ro moved. He opened the Xeno kit and pulled the portable ultrasound scanner, a tool he had trained on exactly twice, during a cross-species medical certification course that Fleet Command had made optional, and his team lead had made mandatory. He pressed it against the Delvhari's abdomen, and the display showed him what Sewer already knew. A slow, steady hemorrhage from a ruptured organ he could not name, pooling in a cavity that did not correspond to anything in human anatomy. "Can you operate?" he asked Sewer. "Not with one arm, but I can guide your hands." She guided his hands. It became a pattern: Ro's training, Sewer's knowledge, Jace's steady supply of instruments and coagulants and sealants that were half designed for the wrong species, but close enough to work when applied with enough precision and enough stubbornness. They saved the female. They moved to the next. What he had tagged immediate, Sewer confirmed or reclassified based on details only she could read. They retagged 7 patients in the first pass, and 4 of the 7 would have died within hours if Ro's original assessment had stood. Behind them, Jace worked the sealed casualties, stabilizing the ones Ro and Sewer had marked for priority treatment, running IV lines with the saline plasma substitute that the Xeno kit carried in limited supply. Behind Jace, Cavallo had freed the pinned adult and was splinting what Sewer identified as a load-bearing limb fracture. The pinned adult had been conscious the entire time, silent and still while Cavallo worked the hydraulic spreader, and when the beam finally shifted and the pressure released, the Delvhari made a single sound, a low, harmonic note that resonated through the deck plating and brought the keening in the corridor down by a half tone. Gratitude, Sewer said later. A gratitude note. The Delvhari had sounds for things that humans only had words for. The corridor was becoming organized. Chaotic suffering was turning into structured response, and the Delvhari were helping the ambulatory ones moving the non-ambulatory ones, clearing debris, holding light panels where Ro's team needed them. An elderly Delvhari male with a deep laceration across his brow ridge that Ro had tagged DELAYED had begun, without being asked, to organize the walking wounded into a supply chain, fetching water from the emergency reserves, distributing emergency blankets, carrying messages between the separated family groups. He did it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had managed crises before, and when Ro asked Sewer who he was, she said, "The ship's purser. He has sailed the migration routes for 50 years. He knows how to hold a ship together." "Ro," Cade's voice again, tighter this time, "we have a problem." He pressed his earpiece. "Go." The reactor. The Delvhari engineering crew managed a partial shutdown after the initial failure, but it's not holding. The containment field is degrading. We're reading a 12% drop in the last hour. If it hits critical, the forward section goes too. "How long?" Their chief engineer says 3 hours, maybe less. He's trying to reinforce the containment manually, but he's working with half his team dead and the other half injured. Ro looked down the corridor. 30 casualties on this deck alone. Cade had another 23 below. Additional tiers had not even been surveyed, yet tiers 5 through 8. 4 decks of habitation space that his team had not reached because there were 5 of them and hundreds of casualties, and not enough hours in any clock. How many survivors total, all forward sections? Best estimate from the Delvhari crew, 760. Give or take. We haven't counted tiers 5 through 8 yet. Could be more. 760 confirmed people on a ship with a reactor that was going to breach in 3 hours, and 1 human frigate clamped to the hull with a medical bay built for 50. Cade, get on the horn to Tanaka. We need the cargo bays cleared for casualty overflow. Every flat surface, every corridor on the Greyhaven. And I need the ship's engineering team over here working on that containment. This is a hold-in-place operation. We're not evacuating 760 through a single docking cut. Already requested. Tanaka's sending Lieutenant Vasquez and a 4-person engineering team. They're cutting through now. Good. There's more, Ro. Cade's voice dropped, and Ro recognized the tone, the one she used when the numbers were bad and she was about to lay them out flat. 760 confirmed. Even if we stabilize the reactor, the Greyhaven can't carry 760. We don't have the life support capacity. We don't have the food, the water, the atmospheric mix. The Delvhari breathe a different nitrogen blend, higher nitrogen, lower oxygen, with a saline vapor component that their gill membranes need to stay functional. We'd suffocate them on our own air before we got halfway to the nearest station. I know. So what's the play? Ro stood in the amber-lit corridor with the keening in his bones and the blue-green stain on his hands and 760 lives on a clock he could not stop. He thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. We hold the ship. We don't evacuate, we stabilize. We keep the forward sections pressurized. We reinforce the containment. We triage and treat in place. And we hold this ship together until the Delvhari fleet gets here. That's 90 hours, Ro. 90 hours on a dying ship with a reactor we don't understand and casualties we barely know how to treat. Then we hold for 90 hours. Silence on the channel. Then Cade said, "Copy, holding." The words settled into the corridor like something solid. Ro felt it in his team the way he always did, not through anything they said, but through the way they moved. Jace's hands steadied on the IV line he was running. Cavallo's posture shifted, the exhaustion leaving her shoulders as the decision gave her something to brace against. Even Suor, who could not have understood the exchange fully, seemed to read the change in the humans around her, and her bioluminescence, faded since the crisis began, flickered brighter for a half-second. As if her body were responding to a signal her conscious mind had not yet processed. Ro turned to Suor. "Your chief engineer, where is he?" "Deck 9, Engineering Control. His name is Vas Angerel." "Take me to him." They moved through the ship. Suor led and Ro followed, and as they descended through the tiers, the damage got worse. The emergency lighting thinned to nothing in places, and Ro clipped his helmet lamp on and watched the beam cut through air that was thick with particulate insulation dust, vaporized coolant, the fine debris of a ship tearing itself apart from the inside. The decks were buckled in places, the metal warped by thermal stress from the reactor's initial failure, and twice they had to detour around sections where the structural members had given way entirely, leaving gaps that opened onto the void. On Tier 5, they found 40 more survivors. They were clustered in a sealed compartment, a communal feeding hall. Suor said that it held atmosphere when the sections around it failed. Families mostly, children. The adults had organized themselves into a perimeter around the children, backs to the walls, and when Ro's helmet lamp swept across them, dozens of dark, reflective eyes turned toward him and the keening stopped. Complete silence. They had not expected anyone to come. They had been sitting in the dark, breathing recycled air, waiting for the reactor to finish what the structural collapse had started. Ro counted heads, 43. He tagged the injured 11 needed immediate attention, the rest were frightened but intact. He did not have time to treat them now. He pulled 2 emergency light panels from his pack, cracked them, and handed them to the nearest adult. "Suor, tell them help is here. Tell them to stay in this compartment. I'll send Cavallo down as soon as I can." Suor spoke to them. Her voice was different in Delvhari, deeper, with harmonics that the translator could not render, a layered sound that carried more than meaning. The adults listened. The children listened. The keening did not resume. Instead, something else began, a low, sustained note shared among them that rose from the group like a held breath finally released. Ro did not know what it was. He filed it and kept moving. On Tier 6, they found a sealed section that had held pressure but lost gravity. 17 Delvhari floating in the dark, some conscious, some not, tethered to furniture and handholds by strips of cloth torn from their own clothing. A Delvhari male with the calm bearing of a ship's officer had organized the tethering, keeping the unconscious from drifting into bulkheads and further injuring themselves. He had a compound fracture in his right leg that he had splinted himself using a broken chair leg and a belt, and he had been floating in zero gravity with that fracture for 39 hours without complaint. Ro secured the room, anchored himself to a structural beam, and assessed the casualties while floating. Zero-G triage was a skill set he had trained for but rarely used, and the disorientation of reading vital signs upside down while managing a hemostatic pack that wanted to drift away from the wound was enough to make his stomach turn. He completed it in 18 minutes. 9 immediate, 3 delayed, 5 functional. He left the 5 functional with instructions relayed through Suor and moved on, adding the Tier 6 count to his running total. The confirmed survivor number climbed, 760 base, plus 43 on Tier 5, plus 17 on Tier 6, 820, and they had not reached Tiers 7 and 8. Suor moved through it like she knew the ship by feel. She probably did. Her hand trailed along the bulkhead as they walked, fingers reading the vibrations the way a sailor reads the hull of a boat in heavy weather. And more than once she stopped Ro before he stepped onto a section of decking that looked solid but was not. "How long have you served on the ship?" he asked. 11 years. She was my first posting after medical certification. I was meant to retire next cycle. Suor paused at a junction, oriented herself, and turned left. The Sulvaan Reach is a migration carrier. She carries families between the spawning grounds and the deep current settlements. I have delivered 206 children aboard this ship. How many children are in the forward sections? Sewer was quiet for a moment, calculating. Before the failure, 192 were registered in forward habitation. After the venting, assuming the sealed tiers held 150, perhaps 160. The rest were aft. Rowe did not respond to the number. He filed it and kept moving, and the weight of the ones who had been aft settled into the space behind his sternum, where he kept the things he could not afford to feel yet. Engineering control was a wide, low-ceilinged space dominated by a central monitoring console that was still operational, its displays casting a blue-white glow over the half-dozen Delvhari working frantically at its stations. The room smelled of ozone and something organic that Rowe could not identify, a Delvhari stress pheromone. He learned later, released involuntarily under sustained pressure. It tasted like copper on the back of his tongue. Vas Andrel was at the main console, a massive Delvhari with scarring along his jaw and hands that moved across the controls with the precision of long practice. He looked up when Sewer and Rowe entered, and his expression, even through the species barrier, communicated exactly one thing: exhaustion. Sewer and a human. He did not seem surprised. He did not seem anything really beyond tired. The containment field has dropped another 2% since I last reported. We are at 86%. Below 80, the cascade becomes irreversible. What do you need? Rowe asked. Vas Andrel studied him. The Delvhari's eyes were like Sewer's, dark, reflective, set wide in a face that was built for deep water pressure rather than atmospheric expression. I need 6 qualified reactor engineers, a full set of replacement containment coils, and 12 hours I do not have. Failing that, I need someone who can hold a manual bypass valve at Station 4, while my remaining engineer reinforces the primary coil from inside the chamber. Manual bypass valve, show me. Vas Andrel led him to Station 4, a subsidiary console built into the base of the reactor housing. The valve was a physical mechanism, not electronic, a heavy wheel and lever assembly designed as a failsafe for exactly this scenario, when the automated systems had failed, and the only option was brute force mechanical intervention. The problem was the environment. Station 4 was inside the containment perimeter, which meant whoever worked it was exposed to the reactor's radiation bleed. The Delvhari were moderately resistant. Their deep ocean evolutionary history had given them some tolerance for ionizing radiation. Humans had no such advantage. The exposure at this distance, Vas Andrel said, would exceed your species' tolerance within approximately 4 hours. We're holding for 90. Then you will need to rotate personnel. I'll rotate, Rowe keyed his comm. Cade, I need 2 bodies down in engineering, rotating 4-hour shifts on a manual containment valve, and I need them to understand that they're volunteering for radiation exposure inside safe limits if we rotate properly. This is not an order. This is a request. Cade did not hesitate. Jace and I will take the first 2 rotations. Cavallo holds the triage line topside. Negative. I'm taking the first rotation. Jace second. You're running the triage, you're better at it than any of us and you know it. You've got Sewer as your anatomy reference and Okafor on the Greyhaven for overflow. I need you up there coordinating. A pause that lasted 1 second. Copy. But you come off that valve in 4 hours, Rowe, not 4:15, not 4:05, 4. Affirm. He took the valve. It was heavy. The Delvhari had built it for hands larger and stronger than his, and the resistance was constant, a steady pressure that required sustained effort to maintain the correct position. The lever wanted to drift. The wheel wanted to turn. His job was to hold both at the exact angle that Vas Andrel marked with a line of engineering tape on the housing, and to not let them move, and to do this for 4 hours in a room that was slowly irradiating him. Rowe braced himself against the housing, got his grip, and held. The reactor hummed around him, a deep vibration that he felt in his teeth and the roots of his hair, and the radiation badge on his chest began its slow, invisible count. Vas Andrew watched him for a long moment. The Delvhari chief engineer's scarred face was unreadable, but his hands had stopped moving on the console for the first time since Rowe entered the room, and that stillness was itself a kind of statement. Then he turned to his remaining crew and spoke in rapid Delvhari, and they went back to work. Rowe held the valve and counted the minutes. At the 1-hour mark, his forearms began to burn. At the 2-hour mark, the burn became a tremor. He compensated by shifting his grip every 15 minutes, alternating which hand carried the primary load, using his core and his legs to brace instead of relying on arm strength alone. Pararescue training had prepared him for sustained physical effort under adverse conditions. The pipeline included a phase called extended operations, where candidates performed technical tasks while exhausted, cold, and sleep-deprived. And the instructor's favorite game was to make the task simple but unending, so that the challenge was not skill but endurance, not strength but refusal. The valve was an extended operations exercise made real. Hold this. Do not let go. The moment you let go, 800 people die. At the 2-hour mark, Vasquez and her engineering team arrived from the Greyhaven. They came through the emergency cut with tools and portable containment generators, and Vasquez, a small, dark-haired lieutenant with burned scars on her forearms from a previous deployment, took one look at the reactor configuration and started asking Vas Andrew questions in technical shorthand that transcended species. Within 20 minutes they had a plan. Reinforce the primary containment coil with a portable generator while manually holding the bypass, then use the window to replace the degraded coil segments with salvaged components from the Sulvaan Reach's own backup stores. It was not a permanent fix. It was not even a good fix. It was a patch job done with borrowed tools and salvaged parts on a reactor design that nobody on the human team had ever seen before, guided by a Delvhari chief engineer who had been awake for 60 hours and was working on memory and muscle, because his reference manuals were in the aft section that no longer existed. But it held. The containment field steadied at 84%. The cascade clock slowed. At the 4-hour mark, Jace came down to relieve Rowe on the valve. Rowe pulled his hands off the mechanism and flexed them. His fingers were cramped into claws, the tendons in his forearms burning like he had been climbing a rope for hours, and checked his radiation badge. Within limits. Barely. The green indicator had shifted to amber at its edge. "You look like hell," Jace said. "Feel worse. How's the triage line?" "Cavallo and Sewer are running it. They've moved the immediates into the Greyhaven's medical bay 19 so far. Tanaka cleared the forward cargo hold for overflow. We've got mattresses from the Delvhari crew quarters, blankets, water purifiers rigged for their saline plasma needs." He paused. Akafer's been working with Sewer for 6 hours straight, learning Delvhari anatomy in real time. She told Sewer it was the hardest on-the-job training she'd ever had. Sewer told her it was the only kind that mattered. Jace settled his grip on the valve. "The kids are the hardest part. They keep making that sound. The keening. Yeah, it gets into your bones. It's how they communicate distress. It's subsonic, mostly below what we hear. What we're hearing is the overtones." "How do you know that?" "Sewer told me." Jace nodded. He did not ask anything else. He took the valve, braced himself, and held. Rowe watched him for a moment. Jace Morrow, 27 years old, from a town in New Mexico that Rowe had never visited, who had enlisted in pararescue because his older brother had been won and died in a training accident. And Jace had decided that the best way to honor a dead rescuer was to become a living one. Jace, who carried a photo of that brother in a waterproof case inside his vest and never talked about it and did not need to, because the photograph was not a conversation. It was a compass. Ro put his hand on Jace's shoulder. Held it there for a second, 1 second. The way they did it, no longer, because longer meant something was wrong and nothing was wrong that they could not handle. Then he went back up to the triage line. The next 40 hours collapsed into a rhythm that was not sustainable but was sustained anyway, because there was no alternative, and because the people sustaining it had trained their entire careers for exactly this kind of impossible. Ro, Jace, Cavallo, and 2 volunteers from the Greyhaven's crew rotated on the containment valve in 4-hour shifts. Vasquez and Vas Angel worked the reactor in tandem, replacing coil segments one at a time, each replacement buying another increment of stability. Between valve shifts, Ro was on the triage line working with Sewer through tiers 3 through 6, systematically assessing, treating, retagging and stabilizing casualties with a combination of human trauma techniques and Delvhari anatomical knowledge that neither species could have managed alone. The 2 species medical protocol they developed in those hours was not elegant. It was not written down. It was improvised in real time, in corridors lit by emergency strips and helmet lamps, with supplies designed for the wrong physiology and tools built for the wrong hands. But it worked because Ro paid attention and Sewer knew her people, and neither of them had time for precision when close enough would keep someone alive. The Greyhaven became an extension of the Sulvaan Reach. Tanaka opened everything: cargo bays, crew quarters, the mess hall, the corridors. Human sailors gave up their bunks for Delvhari children and slept in shifts on the deck plating, using folded uniforms as pillows. The galley rigged a separate water purification line for the Delvhari saline requirements and started producing a nutrient broth that was not exactly what the Delvhari ate but was close enough to keep them alive. 2 Greyhaven cooks worked with a Delvhari nutrition specialist to adjust the formula 3 times, each iteration closer, each one keeping the children from declining further. Commander Adisa Okafor, the ship's doctor, set up a secondary triage station in the Greyhaven's hangar bay and worked beside Sewer for 16 hours straight, learning Delvhari anatomy by doing and teaching human trauma protocols in return. Tier 7 was reached at the 18-hour mark. 31 more survivors, including a Delvhari female who had been trapped in a sealed washroom with 3 children for 49 hours. She had rationed the water from the washroom's plumbing to keep the children hydrated. She had torn the thermal lining from the walls to keep them warm. And she had told them stories. Sewer translated fragments of them later, migration songs about the deep currents and the spawning lights, until her voice gave out and she held them in silence. When Ro cut through the washroom door and his lamp hit her face, she did not move. She looked at him with those dark, reflective eyes, and her bioluminescence, which had been completely dark, pulsed once, weakly, like a candle guttering back to life in a wind. She said one word in Delvhari. Sewer translated it as real. Tier 8 was the worst. A partial decompression had vented the atmosphere, and then the emergency seals had engaged, trapping 38 people in a section that had atmosphere but no heat and no power. The temperature had dropped to -4 Celsius. The Delvhari were cold adapted, but -4 was below even their tolerance, and by the time Ro reached them at the 22-hour mark, 11 had died of hypothermia. The remaining 27 were in various stages of cold injury, and 5 of them were children who had been placed in the center of the group by the adults, surrounded by bodies living and dead that had served as insulation. The adults had given their warmth to the children, and some of the adults had not survived the giving. Ro worked Tier 8 for 4 hours. He treated frostbite on gill membranes, hypothermic cardiac arrhythmias, and cold-induced vascular collapse using warming protocols designed for humans that Sewer modified on the fly for Delvhari physiology. They saved 22 of the 27. 5 were too far gone. The hypothermia had triggered a cascade failure in the secondary circulatory loop, and no amount of warming could restart what the cold had stopped. He tagged them black and moved on. He took his 3 breaths. He moved on. On the way back up from Tier 8, Rose stopped at the sealed compartment on Tier 5, the communal feeding hall where the 43 survivors had been waiting. Cavallo had reached them while Rose was below, and what she had done with the space was the kind of quiet competence that never made it into after-action reports but held operations together. She had organized the compartment into zones, a treatment area along the port bulkhead where she was working the immediate cases, a family area in the center where the children were grouped with their parents, and a staging area near the entrance where the walking wounded could assist with supply distribution. The Delvhari purser, the elderly male with the laceration across his brow ridge, whom Rose had tagged DELAYED on the initial pass, had become Cavallo's right hand, translating her instructions, organizing the ambulatory survivors, and maintaining a calm that spread through the compartment like warmth through cold water. The children were the part that stuck. Delvhari children were smaller than Rose expected, compact, with larger eyes relative to their faces, and a bioluminescence that was brighter and more active than the adults. In the dim compartment they glowed. Not brightly, the stress and cold had dimmed them, but enough that the room had a faint blue-green shimmer, like sunlight filtering through shallow water. Several of them were clustered around a Greyhaven crew member, Petty Officer Dara Lund, a damage control technician who had come aboard to help with structural assessment, and had ended up sitting, cross-legged on the deck surrounded by Delvhari children who had attached themselves to her with the uncomplicated desperation of children who needed an adult to be calm, and Lund had been calm and steady, and she had not left. Rose knelt beside a child who was sitting alone, separated from the group, her bioluminescence almost completely dark. She was holding a piece of fabric, a fragment of clothing, torn and stained, that she pressed against her chest with both hands. She was not keening. She was silent, and the silence was worse. Suor knelt beside him. She spoke to the child in Delvhari, low, careful, the way you speak to someone who has gone so deep inside themselves that ordinary volume might shatter whatever fragile structure is holding them together. The child did not respond. Suor looked at the fabric and her jaw tightened, and she said to Rose, very quietly, "That is her mother's. Her mother was in the aft section." Rose did not have a protocol for this. Pararescue training covered trauma, triage, extraction, advanced life support, combat rescue, water rescue, mountain rescue. It did not cover a child holding a piece of her dead mother's clothing in a dark corridor on a ship that the galaxy had abandoned. There was no tag for this. There was no procedure. He sat down on the deck beside her. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He sat and he was present, and after a long time, he did not count how long, because some moments are not meant to be measured. The child leaned against his arm. Not hard, not with weight, just enough contact to know that someone was there. Her bioluminescence pulsed once faintly, and then she closed her eyes. Rose sat with her until Cavallo took over, and then he went back to work. At the 26-hour mark, a new crisis hit. The Sulvaan Reach's atmospheric processors, which had been running on emergency reserve since the initial failure, began to fail on tiers 3 and 4. The nitrogen-oxygen saline blend that the Delvhari breath started shifting. The saline vapor component dropped below the threshold. Their gill membranes needed, and the Delvhari in those tiers began to show distress. Their gill membranes dried out, cracked, bled. The keening intensified not the distress of injury, but the suffocating panic of an aquatic species losing the atmospheric component that kept their respiratory system functional. Rose had seen drowning. He had pulled people out of floods and water rescues and knew the look of oxygen deprivation in human faces. The Delvhari equivalent was different but recognizable: the frantic gill movements, the widening eyes, the way their hands went to their throats as if they could physically push the missing component into their lungs. Cade, atmospheric failure on 3 and 4. The saline component is dropping. Their gills are drying out. Copy, what do you need? Saline, every drop we have. If we can aerosolize it into the atmosphere on those tiers, we can keep their membranes functional until the processors recover. Cade patched in Tanaka, and within 30 minutes the Greyhaven's crew had rigged a system that would have made any engineer cringe and any desperate rescuer cheer. Portable humidifiers from the ship's environmental stores, loaded with saline solution from the medical bay, piped through emergency ventilation ducting that a Greyhaven damage control team cut and rerouted by hand. The saline mist was not the right concentration. It was not the right temperature. It was not the right anything. But it was wet, and it was salt, and it kept the gill membranes from cracking further, while Voss Angeral's engineering crew fought to bring the atmospheric processors back online. They lost 2 hours to the atmospheric crisis. 2 more Delvhari died, both elderly, both with pre-existing respiratory conditions that the membrane failure pushed past the point of recovery. Rowe tagged them, closed their membranes, and moved on. The 3-breath rule, the ocean closing over the stone. At the 30-hour mark, the reactor containment stabilized at 83%. Vasquez called it a floor not safe, but survivable. The cascade risk dropped from imminent to manageable. Voss Angeral sat down at his console for the first time in 70 hours and closed his eyes, and his hands kept moving across the controls even while he slept. Muscle memory, holding the vigil his conscious mind could no longer sustain. The total survivor count, tallied across all forward tiers, 831. 412 had died in the aft section. 17 more had died on the triage line or from injuries sustained before the Greyhaven arrived. 831 alive, being held alive by 63 humans on a frigate designed for patrol sweeps and small-scale rescue operations. At the 40-hour mark, Rowe lost a patient. A Delvhari male, middle-aged, with internal injuries from the initial decompression event that had been masked by the secondary circulatory loop sewer had warned him about. By the time the hemorrhagic shock presented, it was too late. Rowe worked the case for 20 minutes, chest open, hands inside, plasma everywhere, sewer beside him calling out anatomical landmarks while he chased the bleeding from one vessel to the next and could not stop it. The bioluminescence faded from the Delvhari's skin in a slow wave, like a light going out room by room in a house, and then he was gone. Rowe sat back. He was on his knees in a corridor on a dying ship, covered in blue-green plasma, and a man had just died under his hands. He allowed himself 3 breaths. 3 breaths was the rule. You took 3 breaths, you filed it, and you moved. He had learned that from his instructor at Indoc, a gray-faced master sergeant named Pollock who had pulled bodies out of flood zones and avalanche sites and orbital debris fields for 20 years and who had told Rowe on his first day, "You will lose people. That is a fact. How you carry it is what separates a rescuer from a casualty." Rowe took his 3 breaths. He closed the dead man's eyes. The Delvhari did not have eyelids in the human sense, but there was a nictitating membrane that served the same purpose, and Sewer showed him how to draw it closed with a gentle pressure at the orbital ridge. Then he stood up and moved to the next patient. The keening in the corridor dropped in pitch. The Delvhari who had seen it happen, who had known the dead man, absorbing the loss the way the ocean absorbs a stone. It sinks, and the water closes over it, and the current goes on. At the 44-hour mark, the structural integrity of Deck 6, the zero-gravity section, began to deteriorate. The emergency seals that had maintained atmospheric pressure were rated for 72 hours of continuous load. They had been holding for 85. Rowe was on the triage line on Tier 3 when Cade's voice came through his earpiece with the controlled urgency that meant someone was about to die if they did not move. "Seal breach on Tier 6, slow leak. We have maybe 90 minutes before the compartment depressurizes." "How many inside?" 12. The 17 from your initial count -5 we already moved to 3. The remaining 12 include the officer with the compound fracture. He can't be moved without a stretcher and a gravity assist, and Tier 6 has neither. Roe was already moving. He grabbed Jace, who was between valve shifts, and they went down through the tiers at a pace that was not quite a run and not quite safe on the buckled decking. Sewer followed without being asked, and by the time they reached Tier 6, the leak was audible, a thin, high whistle that meant atmosphere was escaping through a microscopic fracture in the seal material, and the fracture was growing. The 12 Delvhari inside were aware of the leak. They were calm not because the situation warranted calm, but because panic required energy that 85 hours of isolation had consumed. They floated in the dark, tethered to their makeshift anchors, and watched Roe with those dark, reflective eyes. The Delvhari officer with the compound fracture had positioned himself nearest the seal, as if his body could slow the breach. Roe assessed the seal. The fracture was in the bonding compound, not the material itself, a thermal cycling failure, expansion and contraction over 85 hours weakening the adhesive until it cracked. He could hear the whistle growing. The atmospheric gauge mounted near the entrance showed the pressure dropping, 98%, 97. Each percentage point was air leaving the room, and the room could not make more. Jace, emergency seal patch kit. On it. Jace pulled the kit from his pack, a portable sealing compound designed for hull breaches, rated for vacuum exposure. He and Roe worked in zero gravity, anchored by their boots to deck fittings that were not designed for human footwear but held anyway, and they applied the sealant in overlapping layers while the pressure continued to drop. 95%, 94. It's not bonding fast enough, Roe said. The surface is too cold. Sewer moved forward. She placed her webbed hand flat against the seal material, and the bioluminescence in her palm brightened, not decorative, not emotional, but thermal. The Delvhari could generate heat through their bioluminescent cells, a deep ocean adaptation that served them in the lightless, cold currents of their home world. Sewer's palm warmed the seal surface, and the bonding compound caught, and the sealant locked into the fracture line and held. The whistle stopped. The pressure gauge steadied at 93%, lower than optimal but survivable. Roe looked at Sewer's hand, still pressed against the seal, the glow in her palm fading as the effort cost her. Her injured arm was trembling. "Thank you," he said. "You held the valve," she said. "I held the seal. We are even." They evacuated the 12 from Tier 6 to Tier 3, carrying the officer with the compound fracture on a makeshift stretcher assembled from deck panels and tether cloth. The move took 40 minutes, and by the end of it, Roe's arms were shaking and his back had locked up completely, and Jace was carrying the front end of the stretcher one-handed, because his other hand was holding an IV bag above the officer's head to keep the saline plasma flowing. They did it because it needed to be done, and when they set the stretcher down in the Tier 3 corridor and the officer looked up at Roe and made a single harmonic note, the gratitude sound, the one that vibrated in the deck plating, Roe nodded once and went back to work. 810 souls, still counting. At the 50-hour mark, the first Delvhari patrol vessel arrived. Not the fleet, a single scout ship, fast and lightly armed, dispatched ahead of the main formation to assess the situation. Its captain docked with the Sulvaan Reach and came aboard, and Roe watched from the triage line as the Delvhari officer walked through the forward habitation tier and saw what he saw. Human medics working beside Delvhari medics. Human sailors carrying Delvhari children, one per arm, moving them from the damaged tiers to the climate-controlled overflow space on the Greyhaven. Human engineers keeping a Delvhari reactor from breaching, working shoulder to shoulder with Delvhari technicians, using tools designed for hands that were not the same shape. Human pararescuemen on their knees in the corridors with their hands, inside patients who were not their species, and were not their responsibility, and were not their jurisdiction. improvising xenobiological surgery by feel and by partnership. The Delvhari captain stopped in front of Ro. He was tall, even for a Delvhari, broad-shouldered, with the dark markings of a military caste and the bearing of someone who had commanded ships in contested space and had seen things he did not discuss. He looked at Ro's hands, still stained, always stained now. The blue-green worked into the creases of his knuckles and the whorls of his fingerprints, and at the triage tags on the casualties, and at the human medical equipment integrated with the Delvhari supplies, and at Sewer standing beside this human like she belonged there. "You are the one who held the containment valve," he said. "One of several. We rotated. The chief engineer says you held it for the first 4 hours, in the radiation zone, with no protective equipment rated for our reactor type. We had rotation protocols. Exposure was managed." The captain was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The distress signal was filed as non-actionable by the Transit Authority. The Coalition patrol declined to respond. The nearest Delvhari asset was 90 hours out." He paused, and the pause had weight. "How far were you?" 11 hours. "And you came?" "That's the job." The Delvhari captain's jaw tightened, the same expression Ro had seen on Sewer when she first saw the child on the deck. "The job," he repeated. "Your vessel is a frigate, one ship. You brought one ship to a 1,200-passenger emergency with a failing reactor in contested space, and you called it the job." Ro did not know how to answer that, so he did not try. He turned back to the triage line because there were still patients waiting, and the line did not care about rank or recognition, or the weight of what a single word like job could carry when spoken to someone who understood what it cost. At the 62-hour mark, the reactor containment field spiked. A coil segment that Vasquez had replaced blew out with a sound like a rifle shot, and the field dropped from 83 to 79% in 90 seconds. Below 80 was the cascade threshold. Ro was on the valve when it happened. The alarm was a low, grinding tone that the Delvhari used for critical reactor events, and it filled the engineering space like the sound of a hull breaking. Vas Andrel was on his feet instantly, already moving, his fatigue burned away by adrenaline that his body had no business producing after 72 hours awake. Vasquez was cursing in Spanish, pulling the blown coil segment out of its housing, while her team scrambled to fabricate a replacement from the dwindling salvage supply. "Hold that valve," Vas Andrel shouted. "Do not let it slip." Ro held. The valve fought him. The pressure differential from the containment drop was pushing against the bypass mechanism, and the lever was vibrating in his hands with a force that made his arms shake. His radiation badge was already at 60% of his shift limit and climbing. He did not look at it. The field dropped to 78. Vasquez. Working 30 seconds. The field dropped to 77. The reactor's hum became a whine, a sound that climbed in frequency and volume and made the deck plating buzz under Ro's boots. He could feel it in his fillings, in the roots of his teeth, in the marrow of his forearms that were screaming at him to let go. 20 seconds. 76.5. The whine became a scream. Warning indicators across Vas Andrel's console turned red in sequence, each one a system failing, a margin eroding, a line between survival and catastrophe growing thinner. 831 people, the children on the Greyhaven's bunks, the families in the corridors, Sewer somewhere above him on the triage line, all of them on the other side of this valve. Ro's arms were failing, the lever was slipping. He adjusted his grip, dropped his center of gravity, planted his boots against the reactor housing, and pushed with everything that was left: legs, core, shoulders, the stubborn animal refusal to let go that pararescue training drilled into you until it became identity. You held. That was what you did. You held the line, you held the patient, you held the valve, and you did not let go because the moment you let go, people died. He had made that decision a long time ago in a rain-soaked training field in New Mexico, when Pollock had looked at him and said, "The only thing that separates you from the people who wash out is that you will not let go. Not ever. Not even when your body tells you to." Coil in cycling now. The containment field caught 77, 78, 79, 80, 81. Rowe's arms unlocked. The pressure eased and the whine dropped back to a hum and the deck plating stopped screaming. He stood there, shaking, his radiation badge at 74% and still counting, and breathed. Vasquez appeared beside him. Her face was streaked with coolant and sweat, and her burn-scarred forearms were bleeding from a cut she had taken on a jagged coil housing. She looked at Rowe's hands locked around the valve and did not say anything heroic. She just said, "Nice grip." "Can't let go," he said, literally cramped. She pried his fingers off the lever one at a time, working them open the way you work a seized mechanism, carefully, steadily, without forcing it. When his hands were free, Rowe flexed them and winced, and Jace was already there, sliding into position on the valve without being asked. "Go," Jace said. "I've got it." Rowe went. He climbed back up to the triage line because the line did not wait and the patients did not care about reactor spikes, and the keening was still there, vibrating in the deck, a sound he would hear in his sleep for the rest of his life. At the 70-hour mark, Cade came off a 16-hour shift and sat down next to Rowe in the corridor while they both ate emergency rations that tasted like compressed cardboard and washed them down with water that tasted like the inside of a purification filter. Around them, the forward habitation tier had been transformed. The Delvhari casualties were organized by triage category. The immediate stabilized and moved to the Greyhaven's medical bay. The delayed treated in place. The expectant cases, there were 9 now. People whose injuries were beyond what the available resources could address, lying in a quiet section of the corridor with Delvhari family members around them, and a Delvhari elder performing what Sewer called the deep current rites. A low chant that harmonized with the keening and turned it into something that sounded like music, though Rowe knew it was not music. It was farewell. Cade 8, she did not speak for a while. Then she said, "Total losses. 18 on the triage line, including the 11 from Tier 8 hypothermia. 3 more in engineering, 2 from radiation exposure during the initial failure, 1 from a structural collapse during the coil replacement. 412 in the aft section, gone before we got here." Cade did the math. 831 minus 21, 810 as of now. 810. If we hold the reactor and the expectant cases don't deteriorate. She nodded. She took another bite, chewed, swallowed. She was looking at the Delvhari in the corridor, the ones who were stable, who were sitting with their families, whose bioluminescence had brightened over the past hours from the near dark of despair to a faint, steady glow that Rowe had learned to read as survival. Their bodies were telling them they would live. Their bodies believed it before their minds did. "We held," Cade said quietly. "We're still holding." "We held." She said it again, and this time it was not a statement about the present. It was a statement about what had already been accomplished, what 5 pararescuemen and 63 crew on a single frigate had done in 70 hours on a dying ship that the galaxy had written off. Sewer appeared. She moved quietly for someone her size. The Delvhari were graceful in a way that reminded Rowe of deep ocean footage, all smooth motion and minimal resistance. She sat down across from them and held a container of the nutrient broth the Greyhaven's galley had been producing. "Your people," she said to Rowe. "They gave their sleeping quarters to our children. They volunteered. They are sleeping on the deck plates of their own ship, so that Delvhari children can have beds. That's what people do." Sewer was quiet. Her dark eyes reflected the amber emergency light, and the bioluminescence in her skin had brightened to a steady glow. Rowe had learned over the past 70 hours that bioluminescence in the Delvhari was involuntary and emotional. Bright meant safe. Bright meant the body believed it would survive. The fact that Sewer was glowing meant that her body, on some level beneath conscious thought, had decided that rescue was real. "The Coalition filed our distress as non-actionable," she said. "We are not a strategic species. We have no military fleet of consequence. Our migration corridors are economically insignificant. Our value in the Coalition's assessment is zero." She took a sip of the broth. "You came anyway." "We came because someone was dying. That's the only criterion we use." "That is not a criterion the galaxy shares." "I know." Sewer looked at him, and something in her expression shifted, not in a way that human facial recognition software would catch, but in a way that Ro, who had spent 70 hours working beside her and learning to read the language of Delvhari jaw tension and gill flutter and bioluminescent intensity, understood clearly. She was grateful, and she was angry, and the anger was not at him. It was at a galaxy that had heard her ship crying for 41 hours and done nothing, while a single human frigate, undermanned and underprepared and out of jurisdiction, had crossed 11 hours of open space to hold a dying ship together with its bare hands. At the 88-hour mark, the Delvhari fleet arrived. Not the scout, the fleet. 11 vessels, led by a carrier-class dreadnought that dwarfed the Sulvaan Reach and the Greyhaven combined, and they came out of transit in a formation that said everything about what the Delvhari thought of the Coalition's jurisdictional ambiguity. They came armed. They came fast. And they came with hospital ships and engineering tenders, and enough supplies to sustain 810 survivors, until the spawning grounds were reached. Ro was on the triage line when they arrived. He had been on the triage line, or the containment valve, or cutting through sealed compartments to reach survivors. For 88 hours minus the scattered fragments of sleep he had managed in 20-minute intervals on a corridor floor with his back against a bulkhead, and Sewer's voice in his earpiece telling him the next shift was coming, that he could close his eyes, that they would not lose anyone while he slept. He had slept on her word and woken on her word and gone back to work each time because the line was still there, and the patients were still waiting, and the valve still needed holding. The fleet's medical teams boarded within the hour. They moved through the forward tiers with an efficiency that made Ro's jury-rigged operation look like a field exercise, and they were gentle. Ro watched them take over the casualty care, and saw the way they touched their own people, the careful hands, the low harmonic sounds that were not the keening but something else, something that sounded like the opposite of the keening. The bioluminescence in the corridor brightened like someone had turned up the lights. The Delvhari knew the fleet had come. Their bodies knew it before their minds did. Ro stood at the edge of the corridor and watched the handover. Jace was beside him. Cavallo was behind them, leaning against a bulkhead with her eyes half closed, asleep on her feet in the way that only someone who had been awake for 88 hours could manage. Cade was standing by the emergency cut where the Greyhaven's hull met the Sulvaan Reach's, her arms folded, watching the handover with an expression that was professional and satisfied and tired beyond what words could carry. Sewer found him. She walked through the organized flow of the fleet's medical operation and stopped in front of Ro and stood there, saying nothing, until the silence between them held everything that needed to be held. "Your team," she said finally. "My team. The Delvhari do not have a word for what you did. We have a word for rescue. We have a word for courage. We have a word for sacrifice. We do not have a word for strangers who hold a dying ship together for 88 hours because no one else would come." "We do," Ro said. "We call it the job." Sewer's bioluminescence was steady and bright, and the keening in the corridor had stopped. The silence that followed was not the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of arrival, the silence of a held breath released, the silence that came after. Behind them, the Greyhaven was beginning to unclamp from the Sulvaan Reach's hull. Tanaka was recalling her crew. The engineering team was packing up the portable containment generators. The galley was shutting down the Delvhari nutrient line. The bunks that human sailors had given up were being stripped and restored. They would leave the way they had come: one frigate, 5-person pararescue team, 63 crew, underprepared and out of jurisdiction, and 11 hours late for a distress call that no one else had answered. They would file their report. The report would note 21 dead on the triage line and in engineering, 412 in the aft section who had been gone before they arrived. It would note 810 survivors delivered to their own fleet's care. It would note radiation exposure within acceptable limits for all personnel, 1 laceration to Lieutenant Vasquez's forearms, 1 cold weather injury to Specialist Cavallo sustained on Tier 8, and a commendation request for every member of the Greyhaven's crew who had given up a bunk or a meal or a shift of sleep, so that Delvhari children could be warm. The report would not note the keening, because the keening was not a medical fact. It would not note the bioluminescence, because bioluminescence was not an operational parameter. It would not note that Jace Morrow had taken the photograph of his dead brother out of the waterproof case and looked at it once, in the corridor during a shift change on the valve, and that Roe had seen him do it, and said nothing because some things between brothers by blood, brothers by training, brothers by the shared act of holding a dying ship together in the dark, do not require words. The report would not note what Sewer said to Roe in the corridor, in the last minute before the Greyhaven's crew pulled back through the emergency cut and sealed it behind them. She said it in Delvhari, without the translator, and Roe did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. He understood the way she placed her long, webbed hand over his stained one, and held it there for 3 seconds, his own rule, the time you gave yourself between one loss and the next, and then let go. He would find the translation later in the Greyhaven's linguistic database, sitting alone in his bunk at 3 in the morning with the hum of the ship around him and the phantom keening still in his bones. She had said, "The deep current remembers those who swim against it." Roe walked back through the emergency cut and onto the Greyhaven's deck, the airlock sealed behind him. He stood in the corridor of his own ship, which was small and scarred and smelled like recycled air and human sweat, and the faint chemical tang of the decontamination spray that Okafor had cued, and he flexed his stained hands and felt the cramps and the fatigue and the weight of 21 names he would carry, and the knowledge that 810 people were alive because a single ship had turned. Cade was beside him. Jace was behind him. Cavallo was ahead, already moving toward the medical bay for her debrief, still half asleep, still upright, still moving because that was what they did. "Next run?" Jace asked. Roe looked at his hands, blue-green stained into the creases. The color would fade in a few days, the rest of it would not. "Next run," he said. The Greyhaven undocked. The Delvhari fleet held formation around the Sulvaan Reach as the human frigate pulled away, and Roe stood at the observation port and watched the carrier grow small against the backdrop of the transit corridor. In the last moment before the Greyhaven turned, and the Sulvaan Reach disappeared behind the curvature of the lane, Roe saw something he would remember for the rest of his career. The Delvhari fleet's lights, every ship, all 11 vessels, from the dreadnought down to the smallest tender, blinked once, in unison, a single pulse, the deep current salute. The acknowledgement that the current had carried something through that should not have survived the passage, and that the thing that had carried it was already gone, heading back into the dark to wait for the next call that no one else would answer. Roe turned from the port. He went to the medical bay. He let Okafor check his radiation levels and his hands and his back and the bruise on his left knee he did not remember getting. He filled out his section of the after-action report. He cleaned his equipment. He restocked his trauma kit, replacing the hemostatic packs, the cartilage sealant, the saline plasma substitute, all the supplies that had been designed for one species and used on another because that was the world they lived in now. He made a note in the kit log to request additional xenocoagulant formulations for cetacean-type physiology, because the next time, and there would be a next time, there was always a next time, he wanted to be ready. Then he lay down on his bunk, closed his eyes, and listened to the silence. It was the good silence, the kind that came after. The silence lasted 11 minutes, then the calm chimed. "Callaghan." Captain Tanaka's voice was flat, controlled, the way it always was when she was managing something she did not want to manage. "Report to the wardroom. Fleet Command is on the QEC." Rowe opened his eyes, stared at the overhead. The quantum-entangled comms channel meant real-time conversation across any distance, and Fleet Command did not use the QEC for congratulations. They used it for the conversations that needed to happen before the official record solidified, while the language was still soft enough to shape. He sat up. His body protested every joint, every tendon, every muscle fiber that had spent 88 hours working beyond its design tolerance filed a formal complaint. He ignored them all. He pulled on a clean uniform shirt because the one he had been wearing was stiff with dried Delvhari plasma and smelled like ozone and copper pheromones, and he walked to the wardroom. Tanaka was already there, so was Cade. On the wardroom's main display, two faces: Rear Admiral Chen, Fleet Command Operations, and a civilian Rowe did not recognize a thin man in a Transit Authority blazer, with the look of someone who had been woken up to deal with a problem he had hoped would resolve itself. "Technical Sergeant Callaghan," Admiral Chen said. "I've read Captain Tanaka's preliminary report. Impressive work under difficult conditions." "Thank you, sir. The Transit Authority has some concerns." The thin man in the blazer leaned forward. His name appeared at the bottom of the display: Director Havid Salk, Galactic Transit Authority, Incident Review Division. He had the expression of a person about to use the word protocol as a weapon. "Technical Sergeant, the GTA logged the Sulvaan Reach distress as incident noted, recovery assets unavailable. That classification follows established interspecies maritime protocols. The Delvhari vessel was outside human patrol jurisdiction by a margin of 14 light hours. Your diversion into Delvhari transit space was not authorized by the GTA, was not coordinated with the coalition patrol responsible for that sector, and was not consistent with the jurisdictional framework that governs cross-species emergency response." Rowe looked at Tanaka. Her face was stone. He looked at Cade. Cade's jaw was set the way it set when she was calculating how many words she could say before one of them ended her career. "Director Salk," Rowe said, "are you asking me why we responded to a civilian distress call? I am asking you to explain why a UERS vessel diverted from its assigned patrol corridor into a non-human jurisdiction without authorization, potentially creating a diplomatic incident with 3 coalition signatories who have expressed concern about human military vessels operating in their transit lanes." Rowe felt the fatigue settle behind his eyes like sand. He had been awake for the better part of 4 days. He had held a reactor valve until his hands cramped into shapes that did not look like hands. He had sat on a cold deck beside a child who was holding a piece of her dead mother's clothing. And now a man in a blazer was asking him about jurisdictional frameworks. 1,200 civilians on a ship with a failing reactor, Rowe said. 41 hours without response from any authority, including yours. 412 dead in the aft section before we arrived. 810 alive when we left. That is my explanation. Director Salk's mouth thinned. The GTA acknowledges the humanitarian outcome, however the procedural. Director, Admiral Chen's voice cut through like a blade laid flat on a table, not sharp, just present. I have the after-action report. I have the casualty figures. I have the radiation exposure logs for 5 pararescuemen who voluntarily entered a containment zone on a foreign reactor to hold a bypass valve in 4-hour shifts for 3.5 days. I also have, as of 20 minutes ago, a formal communication from the Delvhari Admiralty expressing their gratitude to the crew of the Greyhaven and requesting that Technical Sergeant Callaghan and his team be recognized under the Delvhari Deep Current Honor, which, for context, has been awarded to a non-Delvhari exactly 0 times in the history of their species. Silence on the QEC. Director Salk's expression recalibrated. The procedural review, Admiral Chen continued, will proceed through standard channels. Captain Tanaka's diversion will be logged, assessed, and I expect upheld as consistent with the UERS Standing Order on Civilian Distress Response, which, in case anyone needs reminding, reads, all UERS vessels will respond to verified civilian distress signals regardless of species, jurisdiction, or operational assignment, unless response would create an immediate and unavoidable threat to the responding vessel's crew. Captain Tanaka assessed no such threat. She responded. Her assessment was correct. Director Salk opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The GTA will file its own review. The GTA is welcome to. This channel is closed. The display went dark. Tanaka exhaled. It was the first sound Ro had heard her make that was not an order or a report in 4 days. She looked at Ro and Cade, and for a moment the command mask slipped, and she was just a person who had turned her ship into a dying corridor and held it there, because the alternative was to let 1,200 people suffocate in the dark. Get some sleep, she said. Both of you, that's an order. Ro did not sleep. He went to the mess hall instead because his body needed calories more than rest, and because the mess hall was where the crew gathered after operations, the way water gathers in low ground. Jace was there, eating rehydrated noodles with the mechanical focus of someone fueling a machine. Cavallo was there, her cold weather injury from Tier 8 wrapped in a thermal bandage, drinking coffee with both hands. Petty Officer Lund, the damage control technician who had sat with the Delvhari children for 16 hours, was there, staring at a cup of tea she was not drinking. Ro sat down across from Lund. She looked up. Her eyes were red and not from fatigue. The kids, she said, the ones in the compartment on 5. When the fleet medics came to take them, they didn't want to go. They held on to me. She looked at her hands. 3 of them held on to me, and the fleet medics had to pry them off, and one of them, the smallest one, she had this glow, this light in her skin, she made that sound. Not the keening. The other one. The one Sewer said was. Gratitude, Ro said. Gratitude. Lund's voice broke on the word just slightly, like a hairline fracture in something load-bearing. She picked up her tea, put it down. I'm a damage control tech. I fix hull breaches and electrical faults. I wasn't trained for. Nobody's trained for that part, Ro said. You stayed. That was the training that mattered. Lund nodded. She did not say anything else. She picked up her tea again, and this time she drank it, and the mess hall hummed with the quiet sounds of people processing what they had done, and what it had cost, and what it had been worth. Ro finished his meal. He sat there for a while in the company of his crew and let the weight of it settle. 412 dead, 21 more on the line. A child holding a scrap of cloth. A medic named Sewer whose hand had warmed a seal that kept 12 people breathing. An engineer named Vas Angerel whose hands moved in his sleep. A captain named Tanaka who turned her ship and did not ask permission and did not reply when they told her to stop. 810 alive. The number sat in his chest alongside the other numbers, the ones he carried from previous deployments, previous corridors, previous dark rooms where the injured waited and the dead did not. He would carry all of them. That was the cost. The cost was not the radiation or the cramped hands or the 4 days without sleep. The cost was the carrying. You picked up every name, every face, every keening note that vibrated in your sternum, and you carried them forward because setting them down meant forgetting, and forgetting meant the next time you heard a distress call, you might hesitate. And hesitation in pararescue was measured in bodies. 3 days later, the Greyhaven docked at Candrel Station for resupply and crew rotation. Rowe was in the equipment bay, inventorying the Xeno kit, when Akaffer found him. "You have a visitor," she said. "Docking port 4. He walked to docking port 4. The airlock was open, and standing in the threshold was a Delvhari he did not recognize, tall, with the dark military markings of the caste, wearing a formal uniform that Rowe had never seen before. Behind the officer, through the airlock window, Rowe could see a Delvhari diplomatic courier, sleek and dark against the station's docking ring. The officer carried a case, flat, rectangular, made of a material that looked like polished stone but had the weight distribution of something lighter. The officer stopped in front of Rowe and spoke, and the translator in the station's overhead rendered the words with the same harmonic undertone that all Delvhari speech carried. "Technical Sergeant Rowe Callaghan, by authority of the Delvhari Admiralty and the Deep Current Council, I am instructed to present you and your team with the recognition of the deep current." The officer opened the case. Inside, resting on a bed of dark fabric, were 5 objects, small, circular, made of a material that caught the station's lighting and refracted it into colors Rowe had never seen. Not metals exactly, not insignia, something in between, shaped like a wave frozen at its crest, and when Rowe looked closely he could see that the material was bioluminescent, faintly, steadily. The glow pulsed with a rhythm that reminded him of something he could not name until he could. It was the rhythm of a child's heartbeat, the one he had felt under his fingers in a dark corridor, the one that had steadied and held. "This has never been given to anyone outside our species," the officer said. "The deep current honor recognizes those who swim against the current when the current would carry others past." The council debated for less than 1 hour. The vote was unanimous. Rowe took the case. It was heavier than it looked, or maybe that was just what recognition felt like when it came from people whose children you had held together with borrowed tools and stubbornness, and a refusal to let go. "There is one additional matter," the officer said. He reached into his uniform and produced a data chip, small, standard format, the kind used for personal correspondence across species. "From ship's medic sewer. She asked that this be delivered to you personally." Rowe took the chip. The officer saluted a Delvhari salute, one hand pressed flat over the chest where the secondary circulatory loop ran closest to the surface, the gesture that said, "I acknowledge what you risked." Rowe did not know the proper response. He saluted back the human way, because that was what he had, and the officer's jaw tightened in the way Rowe had learned to read as something that might have been a smile. The officer left. The airlock closed. Rowe stood in the corridor of Candrel Station, holding a case of bioluminescent honors and a data chip from a woman who had guided his hands inside a child's chest and taught him the word for gratitude in a language that was built for the deep ocean. He played the chip that night in his quarters on the station, alone. Sewer's face appeared on the display, her dark, reflective eyes, her steady bioluminescence, the bandage still on her left arm. She spoke in Delvhari, and the translator rendered it, and the harmonic undertones turned her words into something that was almost music. "Rowe Callaghan, the child you saved in the corridor, her name is Vetha. She is recovering. Her bioluminescence has returned to full brightness, and the medical team says the vessel repair is holding. She asks about the human with the blue-green hands. I told her you would come back if she needed you. I do not know if that is true. I said it anyway, because children need to believe that the ones who save them do not disappear." A pause. The bioluminescence in Sewer's skin flickered, brightened. "The Sulvaan Reach will be decommissioned. She cannot be repaired. But 810 of her people will board a new ship, and they will complete the migration, and the children will reach the spawning grounds. That is because of you. That is because one ship turned. Another pause, longer. I have served on migration carriers for 11 years. I have seen the coalition ignore our distress calls 4 times. Twice, the ships were lost with all hands. The Sulvaan Reach would have been the third. You were the difference between the third time and this time, and the difference was not your training or your equipment or your jurisdiction. The difference was that you came. She leaned forward slightly, the way she had when she was guiding his hands along the Delvhari vascular map, teaching him by feel what he could not learn from manuals. The deep current remembers, Ro. It remembers everything. And what it remembers about your species, about you, is that when 1,200 strangers were dying in the dark, you turned your ship. You did not ask if it was your responsibility. You did not calculate the cost. You did not file the signal and wait for someone else. You came and you held and you did not let go. The recording ended. The display went dark. Ro sat in the silence of his quarters and flexed his hands, still faintly stained. The blue-green ghost of it worked into the deepest creases where no amount of scrubbing could reach, and felt the weight of the carrying settle into its permanent place alongside everything else he carried. The names, the faces, the keening that would live in his bones until they stopped being bones, the 3 breaths between one loss and the next. He closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he could see the Delvhari fleet's lights blinking once, in unison, and the glow of a child's skin steadying from flicker to pulse to steady light, and Sewer's hand over his, warm against the seal, holding. The comm chimed, Cade's voice. Ro, we've got a signal. Freighter in distress, Candrel margin bearing 117. Tanaka's already turning. He opened his eyes. He stood up. He flexed his stained hands, felt the old cramps echo in his tendons, and reached for his trauma kit. On my way, he said. The current carried him forward.